Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. So if you've seen enough of my videos, you would know that I am not a religious person. I would not classify myself as a theist. I don't believe in God. So with that being said, I think I should also just set the record that I am not somebody that believes in a soul. So why am I bringing this up for the topic of this video? Well, there's a thing called embodied cognition. And well, it's something that I've defended pretty much throughout my life, I guess, in the areas of what consciousness is and what it means to be a human being, I guess, in as best proximity as I can possibly, you know, explain. Because people that believe in a soul often think that your essence or like whatever like transcends the physical matter, which is, like your body essentially, like the vessel in which you exist, your human body. So to explain embodied cognition real quick off the top of my head, it's basically the notion that consciousness, your awareness, is not separate from your body. So a lot of people that do believe in a soul or we're like energy, whatever that means, or if they talk about us having like a higher sort of like essence, that doesn't really make sense to me. And yes, mentioning that I don't believe in God or anything spiritual or anything like that, you must have also heard in a lot of my videos that I guess essentially I am pretty much a naturalist, materialist, physicalist kind of person in terms of my worldviews and whatnot. Whichever one is technically more accurate there, but basically I'm using those words to say that I don't believe anything transcends physical matter. Physical matter is all that exists in the best in which we can ontologically define what it means for anything to, quote unquote, exist. And I thought I would go about the arguments, why I believe the arguments, my arguments, blah, 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 things like that, in terms of why this worldview makes more sense to me than believing in like some sort of like higher power and we have like a soul and essence or, all that kind of stuff that just sounds flowery, but actually has like, if you ask me, like no logical foundation to like suit it whatsoever. So I never really understood why people thought that consciousness, was a big deal, to be honest. I mean, I guess I could just chalk it up to my NPD, unstable sense of self, which, yes, if you've seen a lot of my videos, you've heard me talk about more than enough times throughout, this channel. So there's also just that. And I don't know, tell me if this video is a bit hypocritical because I did make a video about eliminative materialism as well, which basically argues that essentially there is no such thing as a consciousness whatsoever, or like, our idea of like who we are is just, not real. Like your quote unquote like first person like subjective experience is just, I don't know. Yeah, yeah, has like no foundation whatsoever. And I do catch myself, still believing that because I also do hold a very much like deterministic worldview and whatnot. And the reason I wanted to make this video in particular is because, yeah, I've been thinking about like a whole bunch of things and I've been trying to, contemplate as to whether or not I take more like a rationalist approach or like an empiricist approach in terms of my epistemological, methodology of assessing truth or like whatever. But yeah, when I was looking more at like embodied cognition and I've thought to myself that like yes, technically I've been defending this for most of my life, even before I guess, more so properly now know what it's called. So I guess I'll just go about it like this. And in a way, yeah, in this sense, I would take a more like empiricist approach in terms of consciousness and whatnot. I mean, kind of like what I said, I don't believe in anything transcending the physical matter. I believe everything is essentially just made of like physical matter, or everything that happens is only due to the physical matter and whatnot, regardless of how out of world it may seem to like a lot of people, whatever that even means, because that's already a contradictory like thing to me. There's nothing out of this world. Like by definition, that is already a dead end. We're in this world, everything has to be within this world, blah blah blah, or whatever. So basically, I don't understand why people believe in souls. I don't understand why they believe that like there's supposed to be something that like transcends everything, because like at the bottom line of it, our experiences, our worldly experiences come from, our senses and whatnot. So the reason I see is because of my eyes. The reason I can smell things is because of my nose, taste from my tongue, taste buds, whatever, all that kind of stuff. I can hear due to my ears. I can touch based on, you know, the fucking nerves all over my body. I can feel things because of like, yeah, basically all those like nerves and stuff like that. So I find it hard to believe that if I were to be without that, I would still be me, quote unquote, because from what I understand, people think that, your soul will always just remain like, your essence. Like a lot of like religious people say that like once we die, we, transcend these like well, what is it, mere mortal bodies or like whatever. But when it comes to embodied cognition, it basically argues that like there is no separation from consciousness and the body. So basically, they all have to be, interlinked. But because I believe people, falsely mistake that these things are somehow separate, that's where you get into arguments about like what consciousness is, which I think is like pretty dumb because like in this worldview, I think it is pretty straightforward, and people are just, like religious people, spiritual people, if we're being honest, are just like overly complicating things for no reason whatsoever. So I guess when people ask me like what is consciousness, I know they mean something beyond like the physical matter, quote unquote. Like what does it mean to like, be you? But that doesn't, really make sense to me because and I've thought of this analogy to explain why I think that, okay, your consciousness and your body always have to be intact because otherwise they're nothing without the other. So, say you had a toy that was, battery operated, like so to speak. Um, you could say that the consciousness, relies on the batteries, but, the toy itself is obviously what makes, the toy as well. So I guess when people ask like what consciousness is, to me it sounds like they're trying to say, where do you get the toy and the battery itself? Which literally doesn't make any sense because they're useless without each other. The battery alone is just the battery. It's the driving source in which what makes the toy work. The toy itself is, the vessel in which the toy operates. So when I think of human beings and how we work, I kind of just see our consciousness as, the battery, so to speak, and our bodies are basically the vessel in which everything works together. So I'm trying to know how these things are supposedly separate from each other because kind of like what I said, your senses, your, all this kind of stuff, it's the driving vessel basically in which everything in which you exist, you know, occurs. So I guess this is also naturally why I don't really believe in an afterlife as well, because when I'm dying and I, just cease to exist, so to speak, but my physical body is still here, like, I don't know, whether I get cremated, whether I get buried in the ground and I'm just like eaten by like maggots and I become maggot food. Essentially, my senses will not be there anymore. There will be nothing to pick up from my brain. I can't see, I can't hear, I can't smell, I can't like, I'll be nothing other than bone once the, maggots like eat me up and I disappear. So even if you want to argue, so to speak, that like my consciousness still exists, that doesn't really make sense to me because like, okay, if you don't have a vessel, the consciousness itself is super useless because kind of like what I said about like a battery operated toy, for example, even if my consciousness is still there, so to speak, whatever that even means, I kind of just see it as like the battery. Or like let's just say, in like a similar sort of like example, like you can have a car battery, quote unquote, but if it doesn't have the rest of the car, it's not going to function like a car. It doesn't work like a car. So essentially the car battery needs the rest of the car just as much as the rest of the car needs the car, battery itself. Only in which they come together will everything function and operate the way that it does. Because even if you insist that there's supposed to be like a separate distinction in this case, like for example, human beings and consciousness is useless without some sort of like vessel to drive it, some sort of like body to, make it happen. Or at least this is how I understand it. Which is why I also don't believe in God, because a lot of people will say that God is a disembodied mind, so to speak, and he exists in the sense of like an essence, and I don't really understand that. Because for example, even when people allude to like a higher sense of, let's say, like consciousness, because like, oh, we must be more than like physical matter, like, no, I don't understand that. And I will, rely more on like neuroscience in terms of like this understanding. And the reason why I'm bringing up neuroscience, for example, is because a lot of people think that there must be something more just because there's this like notion of like love. But I would say like love is not special, at least in the overly dramatic way that like, people try to like portray it as. Like it's understandable why it's desirable because, oxytocin has that much of a, effect on the brain when people, experience it. This is why a lot of people like chocolate, because chocolate can also emulate the same effect. It also brings oxytocin in the brain, so to speak. And also, the reason why I think that there has to be a vessel to like consciousness, quote unquote, and how they can't be separate without like the other. Because, for example, how you experience love is determined a lot of times like through your environment. That's why a lot of people, a lot of psychologists and like whatnot will say that like your attachment style typically comes from like your childhood and how your parents raised you, your caretakers, like, basically set a blueprint, so to speak, in terms of like your inclinations in which how you will, pursue love. So I don't really see the notion in which people love as something that's like necessarily innate. And this is why I'm talking about this whole like, yeah, I've been thinking more about whether or not I'm more like rationalist or empiricist. And at least for now I'm thinking to myself that yes, I definitely do lean more towards like an empiricist understanding at this point. And that's not to say I don't have any like rational thinking, because obviously everybody uses both rational and empirical thinking, but at least like in this case, I will give it more to the empirical approach in terms of like at least how I understand my experiences and how I understand, going about things. Because basically, when we talk about ourselves, we always exist in an environment, basically. So I would have to think about this more honestly. Well, what am I not thinking to be honest? But okay, like take like a priori versus like a posteriori, for example. A priori is about like having innate knowledge. A posteriori is about like I guess like knowledge that like you learn from like your senses and whatnot. But in this case, I think I can make an argument as to like how love itself would be something that's more empirical in a sense in this sort of like regard. Because like for example, as a cluster B person myself, I definitely do understand what it's like being in a more like emotionally like neglectful family, so to speak. And in like a lot of like scenarios, for example, the idea of love can even be like strange to a lot of people. Or when I say love, I'm making this like purely synonymous with like oxytocin. So there's no like specific sort of like, oh, platonic, romantic. Like if I say love, I'm just talking about like, let's say like a general affection that anybody might have for somebody like in the slightest. Because I was thinking about this earlier before I, obviously like filming this video now, and I thought about like making this example because a lot of people will think that love is quote unquote like more so innate. But if you, let's say, grew up in a more like like less dysfunctional family, it's easy for you to think that it's just something that's part of you. But arguably, if you grew up in a more like cluster B person's like childhood, something more akin to, let's say, like emotional neglect or caretakers that were not necessarily, the most like emotionally intelligent people, you, I feel like you wouldn't be able to say that you wouldn't have turned out like the same as what you want to assume is innate being in your more like loving family, quote unquote. So how exactly do you explain that like oh, even something as quote unquote like powerful as love is something that is like purely innate within people. Because, for example, oh yeah, this is more so specifically the example that I was also thinking about earlier that I wanted to bring to this video by the time that I'm making it now. Like, because like I can also imagine this, like if you take somebody that was in like foster care their entire life, so they didn't really experience like I guess like any sort of like affection that like caretakers would give them, um, like let's say a parent's hugging their child or just even just holding their hand, I don't know, or like anything like that. Those things would be foreign to those people, which is why I think like it's not surprising, for example, to hear stories when like new like parents quote unquote like adopt a child and stuff, and it takes a while for them to like open up. Well, like okay, it's self-explanatory because they did just get adopted by like obviously like a stranger to begin with. But sometimes I think like they struggle in understanding like how come I can't get this child to like ever open up to me. But it's because like they don't have the brain chemistry or like the brain wiring that you did to think that like okay, just being in a naturally loving family is just like the normal ways in which things are supposed to be. So I wouldn't be surprised, for example, even if like okay, if somebody has barely felt oxytocin in their life, like let's say like yeah, even from like the simple things like somebody giving you physical touch like a hug or like something like that, I wouldn't be surprised if like they could have that in their head. The same reactions might happen, but it'll be so foreign, it'll be so mysterious that like they might have like an aversion to it. They might think to themselves like they could either be confused, they could either be like straight up disgusted because that's what biology does. That's what your brain essentially does. It is, it's the training in your survival instinct basically that like anything that is foreign, anything that is like, not something that is like well familiar to you, just for your own safety, you will typically have a bias to run away from it as, quickly as possible. Well, at least up until you like, assess it better and whatnot, or like gain a bit more confidence in like your understanding of that thing. I'm obviously not trying to say that like, oh, adopting a child is like super terrible and you can't improve that child's life in like any sort of way. Like in a lot of those situations, it might take time, but I'm saying that like they are naturally like that due to the environment in which created that to like happen. So if we know from a lot of like psychological research that like your attachment style or your willingness to trust other people is basically you know determined in a way from like the earliest human interactions that like you've had in your life, there's no way to assess that caring for other people is just like naturally like innate. Well, then again, I know somebody's going to bring up the whole like nature versus like nurture debate again, but I'm not really trying to get into that. But what I'm trying to like explain with like all of this is essentially that you know it's like nothing transcends the experiences that we have like firsthand, quote unquote. And people want to believe that like there are things that are like immediately coded into them, but your firsthand experiences that you think make you you, you're biased to think that those are personal. And however way that we're raised obviously carries with us from like the rest of our lives, where it's like okay, we might go through like I don't know, some like pseudo random sense of like self development or like whatever, but like the basically like that's like an ongoing battle, because to even want to improve is basically trying to like unlearn like I guess like toxic understandings that you have been led to believe by your experiences, that oh, this is how things are, this is how people are, like whatever, and stuff like that. So love even does not transcend any sort of like physical sort of like thing, because in order to trust people more, you're essentially trying to rewire your own brain because you didn't have the privilege like some people that were able to grow up in, let's say, like households where they had more accommodating understanding parents and like stuff like that. So I see the trick and I see the bias that like a lot of people that like, oh, I believe in a soul because oh, there's such a thing as love, there's such a thing as like this or like that, or something like that. But like if you actually just like look at it, it's just the input and programming, like no different than a computer basically. So your experiences are never separate from the environment. And I guess like I just wanted to like overall say that like I guess like it would be hard for me to understand how something can just be like innate in a person in terms of like their cognition. I guess because like every single time you talk in relation to how a person experiences the world or how a person like goes through like, something like always looking at it deep enough, you will always be talking about some form of like environment, basically. How something along the lines of like this reacting with this. Yeah, but exactly like that's my point. I think that's my point basically. Like how you describe you is always reacting to something else. Whether what you're trying to think about, what you're trying to fill in the blanks, so to speak, you're always basing it off something that is always happening to you rather than something that is actually within you. And the more you gather from the things that you're reacting to and the things that like you're thinking about, you might try your best to mold a sense of self out of that, and things might be, easy if, let's say, for the most part, you've had a life where people are typically accepting of you. Whereas maybe if you're a cluster B person such as myself, it just doesn't feel like, I don't know, there's a foundation at all. But yeah, I guess I just wanted to chalk it up to that. There's no separation between mind and body, and the stress or the happiness based on how we've reacted to other things, they impact our psyche, quote unquote, because I don't know, e- e- even because like I was thinking about it even from like a solipsist like point of view. If there was nothing to react to, why would you need to react to yourself? Like that's an impossible question to like answer, I guess, because like what would you be basing yourself off of outside of the experiences of things that you're going through within this like physical world, even if it's all just like a delusion like in your mind somehow. If you're like a brain in a vat, the brain in a vat has to be some sort of like physical thing that is, happening, because if you get an illusion from something, then at the very least, the thing that's creating the illusion is the closest thing to what's real. And I don't know, I guess we could just keep going in like a circle again and again and again in terms of like, okay, then what will actually be real? But like, I don't know. I mean, I'm going on a tangent at this point. But I guess like ultimately, yeah, there is no separation from mind and body. At least that is what I believe. And yeah.